Paul crashes the Beatles' last secret session. John's ultimatum left the team devastated. Los Angeles, California. August 1969. Sunset Sound Recorders. Studio 1. The air was thick with the specific, almost palpable tension that precedes an ending. The Beatles were, for all intents and purposes, over. The public didn't know it yet. The legal documents were still being drafted. But in the hushed, smoke-filled confines of Studio 1, everyone present understood the truth. This was the last. Not the last recording session ever. Not the last time they would be in a studio. But the last time John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr would gather as the Beatles, without Paul McCartney, to work on what would become Abbey Road. The session was a secret. Deliberately so. Paul was in London, ostensibly working on his own projects. But the truth was more complicated. The four had been at loggerheads for months, their creative differences curdling into personal animosity. John, particularly, felt stifled, controlled, unable to pursue his own artistic vision within the confines of the band. Tonight, John was in charge. His energy was a mixture of fierce determination and a profound, almost melancholic weariness. He was pushing the band through I Want You, She's So Heavy, a track that was as much a primal scream as it was a love song. Its heavy, blues rock riff, its extended, almost hypnotic outro, was a deliberate departure from the melodic pop that had defined much of the Beatles' earlier work. George Harrison was on lead guitar, his face grim, focused on the intricate, almost punishing riff. Ringo Starr was behind the drums, his rhythm solid, unwavering, the anchor in a storm. John was on rhythm guitar and vocals, his voice raw, pushed to its limits. Geoff Emerick, the engineer, sat behind the mixing desk, his usual calm demeanor strained. He had witnessed the slow, painful disintegration of the greatest band in the world. He had seen the arguments, the walkouts, the unspoken resentments. Tonight, there was a fragile piece, a desperate attempt to finish something, anything, before it all collapsed completely. The session was isolated. The studio doors were locked. The phones were off. The only people present were the three Beatles, Emerick, and a handful of trusted studio personnel. It was a bubble, a temporary sanctuary from the outside world, a final, desperate attempt to create magic before the spell was broken forever. They were deep into a take, the heavy, grinding riff of I Want You, She's So Heavy, filling the room when the banging started. Not a polite knock. A furious, insistent pounding on the studio door. Everyone froze. The music died. The sudden silence was deafening. John looked at Emerick, his eyes narrowed. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered, his voice laced with a dangerous edge. The banging came again. Louder. More aggressive. Accompanied by a muffled shout that, even through the thick studio door, was unmistakably familiar. "Let me in. I know you're in there. What are you doing without me?" Emerick's face went pale. He looked at John, then at George and Ringo. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. It was Paul McCartney, who was supposed to be in London. Paul McCartney, who had somehow discovered their secret session. Paul McCartney, who was now outside the door, demanding entry, threatening to shatter the fragile peace that John had so carefully constructed. What John Lennon did next, in the face of this ultimate intrusion, would leave the entire team devastated. Not just by his words, but by the cold, unyielding finality of his decision. To understand the weight of Paul's arrival, you have to understand the specific, agonizing unraveling of the Beatles in 1969. It wasn't a sudden break. It was a slow, painful fraying of threads that had once been woven into an unbreakable tapestry. The death of Brian Epstein, their manager, in 1967 had removed the one figure capable of mediating their increasingly divergent personalities and ambitions. The disastrous Apple Corps venture had turned their creative hub into a financial quagmire. But the deepest cracks were personal. John's growing artistic and personal bond with Yoko Ono had created an unbridgeable chasm between him and the other Beatles, particularly Paul. Yoko's constant presence in the studio, her artistic influence on John, was seen by Paul as an intrusion, a betrayal of the sacred bond of the band. Paul, meanwhile, had become increasingly controlling, attempting to steer the band's direction, to maintain the melodic, commercial sensibility that he believed was their strength. John resented this, seeing it as an attempt to stifle his own experimental urges, to keep him tethered to a past he desperately wanted to escape. The Get Back sessions earlier in the year, which would eventually become Let It Be, had been a disaster. Filmed for a documentary, they had captured the raw, unvarnished animosity between the band members. Arguments, walkouts, unspoken tensions, it was all there, laid bare for the cameras. By August 1969, John had already privately told the others he was leaving the band. The decision was made. The separation was imminent. But they had agreed to keep it quiet, to finish Abbey Road as a final, dignified statement. This session in Los Angeles was part of that fragile agreement. A last-ditch effort to complete John's tracks for the album, without the inevitable friction that Paul's presence now guaranteed. It was a tacit acknowledgement that they could no longer work together in the same room, at the same time, without descending into open conflict. Paul's arrival was not just an interruption. It was a violation of that unspoken truce, a deliberate act of defiance against the new, painful reality of their separation. He was asserting his claim, his right to be present, his refusal to accept that the Beatles could exist, even for a single session, without him. The banging on the door continued. Relentless, furious, John walked to the door, not to open it, to stand in front of it, his back to the rest of the band, his posture rigid. He knows, George muttered, his voice barely audible. He knows we're trying to finish without him. Ringo simply shook his head, his face a mask of profound sadness. He loved them both. He hated this. John stood at the door, listening to the pounding, to Paul's muffled shouts. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the weariness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He turned to Emmerich. "Don't open it, Jeff," John said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. "Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact." The banging on the door intensified. Paul's shouts became clearer, laced with frustration and a raw, wounded anger. "John, I know you're in there. What are you doing? This is our band. You can't do this without me." Emmerich looked at John, then at George and Ringo. The tension in the room was unbearable. The sound of Paul's voice, raw and desperate, was a physical presence, pressing against the walls of their fragile sanctuary. "John," Emmerich said, his voice hesitant. "Maybe we should just talk to him. Explain what we're doing." John turned, his eyes cold. "There's nothing to explain, Jeff. We're working." "He's not." He walked back to the mixing desk, picked up his microphone, and pressed the talkback button. The red light glowed. His voice, amplified, filled the small space between the studio door and the control room. "Paul," John said. His voice was calm, controlled, but it carried an edge of steel that cut through the door and into the hallway. "Go home." The banging stopped. Abruptly, the sudden silence was more shocking than the noise had been. Then, Paul's voice, amplified by the microphone on the other side of the door, came through the studio speakers. Raw, wounded, furious. "Go home. What are you talking about, John? This is our album. This is our band. You can't just shut me out." John looked at George and Ringo. Their faces were grim. They understood what was happening, what John was doing. He pressed the talkback button again. "Paul," John said. His voice was still calm, but now it was imbued with a profound, unyielding finality. "Listen to me. If you walk through that door, if you come into this studio tonight, then the Beatles are over. Right now, no album, no more songs, no more anything. It's done." The words hung in the air. Heavy, irreversible. George closed his eyes. Ringo stared at his drum kit, his hands clenched. Emmerich felt a cold dread spread through him. He had heard John say he was leaving the band before, but never with this specific, absolute finality. Never with this ultimatum. On the other side of the door, Paul was silent. The studio speakers crackled with the sound of his heavy breathing. "You don't mean that, John." Paul's voice finally came through, softer now, laced with disbelief. "You can't mean that." "I mean every word of it, Paul," John said. His voice never wavered. "This is it. Your choice. You walk away, we finish the album. You walk in, it's over. Forever." Another silence. Longer this time. Filled with the unspoken history of two men who had been inseparable for a decade. Two men who had created a world together. Two men who were now standing on opposite sides of a locked door, making a choice that would define the rest of their lives. Then a sound. Not a shout. Not a bang. A muffled thud. As if something heavy had been thrown against the wall in the hallway. And then, footsteps. Retreating. Fading away down the corridor. Paul was gone. John released the talkback button. The red light went out. The studio was silent. The silence was heavier than any music. It was the sound of an ending. The sound of a choice made. The sound of a line drawn in the sand, crossed by one man, and respected, with agonizing pain, by another. John turned to George and Ringo. His face was pale, but his eyes held a grim satisfaction. "Right then," John said, his voice hoarse. "Let's finish this bloody album." But the team was devastated. Not by Paul's departure. By John's ultimatum. By the cold, brutal finality of his words. They had just witnessed the true, undeniable end of the Beatles. And it had happened not with a public announcement, but with a whispered threat through a locked studio door. The rest of the session was a blur of grim determination. John, George, and Ringo worked in a silence that was punctuated only by the music and the occasional, terse instruction. The camaraderie, the easy banter, the shared laughter that had once defined their sessions, was gone, replaced by a professional efficiency that felt colder, harder, more brittle than any open conflict. They finished, "I Want You, She's So Heavy." The extended outro, with its relentless, grinding riff, its sudden, abrupt cutoff, felt like a sonic representation of the night's events. A powerful, almost violent ending. A deliberate severing. Emmerich, the engineer, worked with a heavy heart. He knew the significance of what he was recording. He knew that every note, every chord, every vocal take was imbued with the weight of this ending. He felt like an archaeologist, meticulously documenting the final moments of a dying civilization. George played his guitar parts with a furious intensity, channeling his own frustrations and resentments into the music. Ringo's drumming was precise, powerful, the steady heartbeat of a band that was bleeding out. John's vocals were raw, unvarnished, a primal scream of both love and pain, a desperate attempt to express something that words alone could not contain. But even as they worked, the ghost of Paul's presence lingered in the studio. The memory of his voice, raw and wounded, echoing through the speakers. The image of him, alone in the hallway, making the agonizing choice to walk away. The team was devastated, not just by the end of the Beatles, which they had all seen coming, but by the manner of its ending. The cold, calculated ultimatum. The deliberate severing of a bond that had once seemed unbreakable. They knew that Abbey Road would be a masterpiece, a fitting swan song for the greatest band in the world. But they also knew that it would carry the scars of this night. The unspoken tensions, the unresolved conflicts, the profound sadness of an ending that was both necessary and utterly heartbreaking. John, after the final take, walked out of the studio without a word. He didn't look back. He didn't acknowledge George or Ringo. He simply walked away, leaving behind the silence, the lingering scent of cigarette smoke, and the profound sense of loss that permeated the room. George and Ringo stayed for a while, sitting in silence, listening to the playback of "I Want You, She's So Heavy." The music was powerful, devastating, a testament to their collective genius, even in its final, fractured moments. "That's it then," George said finally, his voice flat. "It's really over." Ringo nodded, his eyes distant. "Yeah," he said, "it's over." They packed up their instruments. They left the studio. The doors were locked behind them. The lights were turned off. Studio One, which had witnessed so much magic, was now just an empty room, holding the echoes of a band that had died not with a bang, but with a whispered ultimatum through a locked door. Paul McCartney did not go home immediately. He walked out of Sunset Sound Recorders, not to his waiting car, but into the Los Angeles night. He walked for hours, through the quiet, tree-lined streets, the warm California air a stark contrast to the cold fury that raged within him. He had heard John's ultimatum. Every word. The cold, unyielding finality of it. If you walk through that door, then the Beatles are over. Right now, no album, no more songs, no more anything. It's done. He had stood there, in the hallway, listening to the silence that followed. The silence that stretched between them, filled with a decade of shared history, of laughter and arguments, of triumphs and failures, of a bond that had once seemed stronger than any force on earth. And then he had made his choice, the most agonizing choice of his life. He had turned and walked away, not because he agreed with John, not because he accepted the ultimatum, but because he understood, with a chilling clarity, that John meant it, that this was not a bluff, that if he had pushed that door open, if he had forced his way into that studio, John would have ended it. Right there, right then, and everything they had built, everything they had fought for, would have collapsed in a public, messy, undignified heap. He had chosen the lesser of two evils. He had chosen to preserve the album, to preserve the legacy, at the cost of his own pride, his own right to be present, his own desperate need to keep the band together. He walked until the anger began to subside, replaced by a profound, aching sadness. The kind of sadness that hollows you out, leaving you empty and raw. He found himself in a deserted park, sitting on a cold bench, staring up at the unfamiliar Los Angeles stars. And there, in the quiet anonymity of the night, Paul McCartney, the most famous musician in the world, wept. Not for the band, not for the money, not for the fame. He wept for the friendship, for the bond that had been broken, for the shared dream that had turned into a nightmare, for the boy he had met in Liverpool, who had become his partner, his confidant, his brother, and who had just, with a few cold words through a locked door, severed their connection forever. He wept for the unspoken words, the apologies that would never be made, the understanding that would never be reached, the future that would never be. He sat there until the first hint of dawn touched the sky, his face streaked with tears, his heart heavy with a grief that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had been humiliated, not by John's words, but by the situation itself. by the brutal reality of their fractured relationship, by the public spectacle of their private pain, by the knowledge that he had been shut out, excluded, deemed unnecessary. And he had chosen to accept it, to walk away, to let the ending happen, not on his terms, but on John's. He finally made his way back to his hotel, exhausted, emotionally drained. He called Linda, his voice hoarse, unable to articulate the full depth of what had happened. "It's over, Linda," he whispered. "It's really over." The sun rose over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the city. And in Studio One of Sunset Sound Recorders, the tape of "I Want You, She's So Heavy" sat on the reel, holding the echoes of a band's final, fractured moments, and the chilling finality of an ultimatum that had sealed their fate. The public announcement of the Beatles' breakup came in April 1970, 7 months after that night in Los Angeles. It was a carefully managed affair, designed to minimize the drama, to present a united front, to preserve the legacy. But the truth was far messier. The legal battles dragged on for years, bitter and acrimonious, tearing at the fabric of their shared history. The public watched, fascinated and heartbroken, as the dream dissolved into a painful reality. John Lennon never spoke publicly about the incident at Sunset Sound. He never mentioned Paul's attempt to crash the session or the ultimatum he had delivered through the locked door. It remained a private, unspoken wound, a moment of brutal honesty that he chose to keep hidden from the world. Paul McCartney, too, remained silent about the specifics of that night. He spoke of the pain of the breakup, the difficulty of moving on, the lingering sadness of a lost friendship. But he never revealed the full extent of the humiliation he had felt, standing outside that locked door, forced to choose between his pride and the band's legacy. George Harrison and Ringo Starr, the silent witnesses to John's ultimatum, carried the memory with them. They understood the finality of that moment, the irreversible nature of John's decision. They knew that the band had truly ended that night, not with a whimper, but with a cold, hard declaration of independence. Abbey Road was released in September 1969, just weeks after the Los Angeles session. It was hailed as a masterpiece, a triumphant return to form, a fitting farewell. Critics praised its cohesion, its melodic brilliance, its innovative production. But for those who knew the truth, the album carried a different weight. The heavy, grinding riff of "I Want You, She's So Heavy," with its abrupt, almost violent ending, felt like a sonic representation of the band's final, fractured moments. The beautiful harmonies, the intricate arrangements, the collective genius, all of it was imbued with the profound sadness of an ending that had been forced, brutal, and utterly heartbreaking. The team at Sunset Sound Recorders, the engineers and studio personnel who had witnessed the incident, carried the story with them. It became a legend, a whispered tale of the night the Beatles truly ended, not with a public announcement, but with a private, devastating confrontation. Jeff Emerick, in his memoirs, alluded to the tensions of the Abbey Road sessions, the difficulties of working with John and Paul, but he never revealed the full details of that night in Los Angeles. He respected the unspoken code, the sacred trust of the studio, the privacy of the artists he had worked with. But the memory of John's cold, unyielding ultimatum and Paul's agonizing choice to walk away remained with him. A chilling reminder of the human cost of creative genius and the brutal reality of an ending that was both necessary and utterly devastating. New York City, December 8, 1980. John Lennon was murdered. The world mourned. The public narratives of his life were cemented: the Beatle, the activist, the peace campaigner, the difficult genius. And in the outpouring of grief, the stories of his relationship with Paul McCartney were re-examined, reinterpreted, recontextualized. The bitterness, the rivalry, the public spats, all of it was softened by the tragedy, transformed into a complex, imperfect love story. But the truth of that night in Los Angeles, the cold, brutal finality of John's ultimatum, remained largely hidden. Paul McCartney, in the years after John's death, spoke often of his former partner. He spoke of their shared history, their creative bond, their enduring friendship. He spoke of his regret for the arguments, the misunderstandings, the lost years. But he never spoke of the locked door. He never spoke of the ultimatum. He never spoke of the humiliation he had felt, standing in that hallway, forced to choose between his pride and the band's legacy. It remained a private wound, a scar that he carried with him, a testament to the brutal reality of their ending. Sunset Sound Recorders still stands in Los Angeles. Studio One still hosts countless recording sessions, countless artists, countless moments of musical creation. The walls have absorbed decades of sound, of laughter and tears, of triumphs and failures. And somewhere in its acoustic memory, in the way that great spaces absorb and retain the residue of extraordinary human events, there is the echo of an August night in 1969. A furious pounding on a locked door, a cold, unyielding voice delivering an ultimatum, and the sound of footsteps, retreating down a hallway, carrying the weight of a choice that would define the rest of their lives. The Beatles ended not with a bang, but with a whisper through a locked door, a whisper that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, 1,000 unresolved conflicts, 1,000 shattered dreams. John Lennon, the man who had always pushed boundaries, who had always sought to dismantle the comfortable and the familiar, had, in that moment, dismantled the greatest band in the world. Not with anger, but with a cold, hard logic. Not with a public declaration, but with a private, devastating ultimatum. And Paul McCartney, the melodic genius, the architect of their most beautiful songs, had been left outside, humiliated, forced to accept an ending that was not his to choose. The last secret session, the last time they were almost all together, the last moment before the final, irreversible break, and the echo of a locked door, forever holding the sound of an ending that was both necessary and utterly heartbreaking. The official history of the Beatles tells of a breakup in April 1970, a public announcement, a legal battle, a slow, painful dissolution. But somewhere in Los Angeles, in the acoustic memory of a studio, there is the echo of an August night in 1969, a furious pounding on a locked door, a cold, unyielding voice, delivering an ultimatum, and the silence that followed, the silence of a choice made, the silence of an ending, the silence of a humiliation that was never spoken of, never reported, never fully understood, except by the two men who stood on opposite sides of that locked door, and the team who watched as the greatest band in the world died, not with a bang, but with a whisper. The end. If this story about the brutal reality of endings, the profound cost of creative genius, and the devastating power of an unspoken ultimatum moved you, subscribe and leave that powerful like below. Share this with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the most significant moments happen in private, behind locked doors, and are never fully revealed to the world. What ending in your life felt both necessary and utterly heartbreaking? Tell us in the comments below.